All right. She's a fantastic White House correspondent over at PBS NewsHour. One of my favorite people to watch on the media circles, and that's Laura Barron-Lopez. Laura, Mike Leon, Nick Savary, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Laura, I was telling you this off air. We were talking about why we wanted to have you on. Nobody better to cover the White House and what we just saw this past week in the State of the Union. We were talking about the speech overall in our first segment, but I want to get impressions from you because the president hit on a bunch of different things from the debt ceiling battle, police reform, fentanyl production, a bunch of different items. What are you hearing in terms of how the administration is viewing this speech? Was it successful or not successful? And how did the president perform, at least, to the people out there in DC and the administration's eyes?
Yeah, inside the administration, I mean, his staff, the senior aides, they could not be more excited about how the speech went. I was texting with a senior White House official on the day after the speech, and they told me that they were pumped, that they felt as though Republicans essentially walked into a trap, specifically on that debt ceiling interaction that you just mentioned, because they said that, the president went in essentially kind of expecting some of those Republicans to heckle him and to go after him and potentially boo him. And in that specific instance, this White House official told me that booing allowed the president to then say, okay, so we agree. We agree that there should be no cuts to Social Security or to Medicare. And in front of the biggest audience that the president probably will get all year, there's more than about 30 million or so people that tuned into his 2022 State of the Union speech. And so it's the biggest audience that he's going to have. And he essentially kind of negotiated right there on the floor with Republicans. And he even said that in an interview a day later with our NewsHour's Judy Woodruff, where he said that he was expecting Republicans to do that. And he clearly enjoyed the back and forth. So that was one thing that stood out. Another thing that stood out to me and to a number of Democrats that I was talking to right after the speech, particularly members of the Congressional Black Caucus, was that he decided to explain to the entire country what the talk is. The talk is that Black and brown families have to have with their kids, that these parents have to have with their kids when they interact with police. And having covered President Biden, since he was vice president, but in particular very closely throughout the 2020 Democratic primary, it was striking to hear him actually explain what the talk is, and also say that as a white father, he never had to have that conversation with his kids, with his white kids. And so the reason it was so striking to me was that during the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, Biden at the time was getting attacked from fellow Democratic candidates because he had been going around saying that he used to work really well with segregationists in the Senate, and also because he was the author of the crime bill. So that really felt like just from, I guess, just this huge progress to hear him come from that to explaining what the talk is and really give some time to police brutality in his speech.
Laura, how does this speech compare to you from 2022 or even just, other State of the Unions in general? Obviously, we noted it's interesting. So I read the transcript of the speech, and I did that intentionally just to, just see from a language standpoint. And Mike watched it and listened to, obviously. From your stance, though, how did that speech compare just from its intention to the engagement with Republicans? Biden on the microphone. What was your read of the speech's purpose, and do you feel like it landed on its mark?
I think that the president and the White House officials definitely think that it did what they meant for it to do going in. And compared to 2022, we have to remember that 2022, he gave that State of the Union speech, that address to Congress, right after Russia invaded Ukraine. And so a huge portion of that speech was, especially at the top of it, was dedicated to that, to his decision to defend Ukraine, for US to really try to unite NATO in defense of Ukraine, in defense of democracies. And he still talked about that during this speech, but it was much lower down in this speech, whereas in 2022, it was higher up. He still talked about defending democracies and that an attack on a democracy abroad is an attack on all democracies. But this speech was much more about, especially the top portion as well as like the middle chunk of it, was all about what he had accomplished during the first 2 years of his presidency, and now what Americans were going to see from that, because a lot of it is being implemented just now. So you see he's going around the country, whether it's to Baltimore and New York last week. This week, he was in Wisconsin today, in Florida. And a lot of that is around the money that is being doled out from the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the millions that are being spent across the billions, that are being spent across the country to improve infrastructure, to start new projects, to build new tunnels, to replace lead pipes. And that was a core part of his speech because, one, it was trying to explain to the American public, look, all of these projects are going to be starting now, which means all of these jobs are going to be opening up, at manufacturing jobs, and that they don't necessarily require a college degree. That is a huge part of his argument right now as he's going across the country, because he is trying to win back white working class voters. You know, Democrats have a solid base of Black voters, Latino voters, working class all the way up to, you know, wealthy across those two demographics. But white working class voters in particular have moved away from Democrats and towards Republicans in the last few election cycles. And so you've seen that with that argument, he's trying to win some of those back by saying this is not going to require a college degree. And so that was a huge portion of his speech. Another part of his speech was clearly trying to be empathetic with the American public by saying, one, he thinks, you know, his argument and his administration's argument is that the economy is resilient and that it's strong, and that unemployment is low. You know, some 12 million jobs were created since 2021 under his watch, but that he understands that the cost of living is still high and that consumer goods are still high. And so one thing in particular about his speech that stood out to me was how much time he spent on junk fees. You know, what he calls, and what actually a lot of other Democrats like Senator Elizabeth Warren have called junk fees. In that, he's talking about overdraft bank fees, resort fees for hotels that he said aren't exactly resorts. He also had this line that seemed to get a lot of reaction in the chamber about airlines, you know, treating your children like baggage. So trying to tell the public that he understands things are expensive, and he is, you know, proposing bills that he hopes Congress then takes up to make things less expensive.
Quick break here. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you could see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee, since 2009, this Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'm going to read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here, fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee?
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. You know, if you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show. Laura, you know, we can't get past the person over the president's right shoulder for people watching on TV, and Kevin McCarthy, and some of the head nods in either direction, a few claps here and there. I hate when everybody stands, but we could get into that for another podcast. But obviously much was made of the previous week's meeting between Speaker McCarthy and President Biden. What's next on the conversation list for these two gentlemen, and specifically the agenda that Speaker McCarthy has kind of laid out for the GOP conference? Like, what do you expect over these next couple of weeks with respect to the administration and President Biden, Speaker McCarthy meeting again? And then where are we with some of the stuff that the president talked about in the speech getting done?
So specifically on the debt ceiling, which, as we know, the Treasury Department is now taking extraordinary measures to try to make sure that the country doesn't default on its debt. And around late spring or so, we're not quite sure when the country is going to reach its debt ceiling. To explain what that means is that when the country defaults on its debt, it's catastrophic, essentially. We have never gone over the cliff. And if we were to go over the cliff, it would be actually catastrophic for everyday people, meaning that benefits would be cut, checks wouldn't go out to veterans, interest rates would go up, all kinds of things like that. And so since that meeting that you just mentioned, Mike, about between Speaker McCarthy and President Biden, they left that meeting saying that they think that they can come to an agreement so that way the debt ceiling is lifted and the country doesn't default on its debt. Now, there's a lot of time, though, for things to go wrong because, again, it's not going to happen until late spring, early summer. Around March, we're expecting to see the president release his budget, and the White House is expecting to then see Republicans release theirs. And that is all a part of this deal making. The White House's public position is that they're not going to negotiate around the debt ceiling. They want the debt ceiling to be lifted on its own, and then separately, they might be willing to negotiate about spending cuts and whatnot with Republicans, depending on what Republicans propose. But again, they are asking Republicans to release exactly what they think they want to cut. And so far, despite really pushing the fact that they think there needs to be spending cuts in order to rein in the country's debt, Republicans have not issued specifics on that. So around March, we're expecting to see more specifics. There, of course, will be more meetings. In terms of their relationship, President Biden said it during his speech. He said it a lot around the speech, that he considers Speaker McCarthy to be a decent man, that he thinks that they can work together. McCarthy also seems to be reciprocating that. But you also mentioned in terms of just the overall agenda for the House GOP. It's very different than what we're seeing from the agenda from the Senate GOP. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, of course, has had a much longer relationship with President Biden than Speaker McCarthy. And they have passed bills together. That bipartisan infrastructure law I just mentioned, that was something Senator McConnell voted for. Speaker McCarthy, who wasn't speaker yet at the time, did not vote for that. The same with the semiconductor bill that was passed, which, is supposed to improve manufacturing of semiconductor chips, which are in vehicles, smartphones. McConnell voted for that. I'm pretty positive. McCarthy, I know, did not vote for that bill. So when it comes to what they can potentially work on together, a lot of Democrats I talked to after the speech said they don't expect any major pieces of the legislation to pass in the next 2 years because of that divided government, because Republicans control the House. So any big thing on policing reform, they don't expect it. Any big compromise on immigration reform, they don't think it's going to happen. So Republicans are very focused right now, and we've seen, especially this week with their investigations launching, they're focused on political investigations, essentially, of President Biden and his administration. And while the chairmen say that they want their investigations to be taken very seriously, there is, a lot of hypocrisy around the investigations. Chairman James Comer of the Oversight Committee is saying that is requesting documents from the DOJ relating to the classified documents that President Biden had, as well as that former Vice President Pence had, but is not requesting any type of visitor logs or material around the classified documents related to President Trump. So right now, the House GOP focuses very much on those investigations, whether it's into Biden administration cabinet officials, into the president himself, into his family. and not so much right now on trying to pass any type of bipartisan legislation.
Laura, that was you walked into my question there because looking at Governor Sanders of Arkansas's response, and in general, what we've seen in terms of the messaging from especially the House GOP, what seems to be from a policy standpoint, because when we saw Governor Sanders' response, and I'm rolling my eyes for anyone who's just only listening to this, again, about left-leaning ideology, critical race theory, all these things. But from your stance in terms of a policy-based response, obviously the president is inviting one, but from what you're seeing in terms of the Republican messaging coming out of the State of the Union, does there seem to be any level of focus or any clarity on what the Republican policy vision is?
So it's difficult to answer that question, but I know that the initial policy response from House Republicans in particular has been, they did pass some bills around abortion, of course, bills that are never going to be passed by the Senate Democratic majority and would never be signed by President Biden. They passed a bill that would allow for prosecution of doctors who perform the abortion procedure. I expect we are going to see more abortion-related anti-abortion bills coming out of the House GOP. That's one front. You're going to see a lot of messaging around the border and a lot of bills passed that are potentially just focused on border security. But what's interesting there is that there may not necessarily even be enough votes within the House GOP because the majority is so slim. So they essentially need every House Republican to vote for the bills that they want to see passed, because Democrats, the Democratic caucus is overwhelmingly going to vote against the majority of the bills that they put on the floor. And so right now, the immigration bills that they are potentially proposing from a lot of Texas Republicans, not all of the Republicans and not all the Texas Republicans even agree on those immigration bills, which is why you haven't really seen them come to the floor. And I think we're going to see that more and more with House Republicans. It's also what makes the situation around the debt ceiling, according to economists, whether it's the U.S. Chamber, and I've spoken to the U.S. Chamber, which leans more conservative, AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which leans conservative, is a conservative think tank, or you talk to Democratic-leaning economists, they're all really worried about the debt ceiling because of the fact that even if Speaker McCarthy agrees to a clean debt ceiling increase, there are probably 5 or more House Republicans, and that's all it takes, who do not want to vote for that. And they could just decide to present a motion to vacate the chair. I know that sounds really wonky, but vacate the chair essentially means that they just put a motion forward to kick McCarthy out of the speakership. And that could happen at any moment if they're not happy with the bills that he puts on the floor, and it would only take like 5 of them.
I'm laughing. That is so wild, but we all knew all this already. Laura, before we let you go, I did want to ask you, we've had over the last couple of weeks, Ellie Honig from CNN, former DOJ prosecutor. We've had Pete Lapp, a former FBI agent. We've been talking about all the classified document investigations. I'm curious, though, from what you're hearing in D.C., you just mentioned about Representative Comer from Kentucky there and the investigations into the Biden family themselves. But where do we expect when we'll actually hear some news from the special counsels with respect to President Trump's investigation, President Biden's investigation? Like, where do you see some of this shaking out over the calendar year?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't think anyone knows. Even the lawyers that I've talked to say it really is up to the special counsel how long these investigations are going to take or how quickly they are going to move. In the case of the special counsel, Jack Smith, who's the one that is overseeing the investigation into President Trump, there are multiple things that he's looking at. He is not just investigating the classified documents that Trump had. He's also investigating what Trump did to potentially overturn the 2020 election. So he has multiple things that he is looking at, that special counsel. Then special counsel Robert Hur, who's looking into President Biden's classified document situation. Some legal experts that I've spoken to said that they think that will be a faster investigation simply because of the investigations differ at the point that the documents were discovered. So President Trump's documents, he was notified by archives, by National Archives, you have all these classified documents, we need them back. And basically, from that point, for more than a year, President Trump and his team obstructed. They did not give those documents back. They did not cooperate, which is what ultimately led to the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago. The difference in President Biden's case is that his staffers, his aides found the documents. His private attorney then reached out to archives and said, we have these documents. We want you to take them off our hands immediately. And from that point on was cooperating with National Archives, was cooperating with DOJ. The steady trickle of the documents, of course, does not look good for the president. Also the lack of transparency here and there with the public, although legally he doesn't have to disclose any of this information, but there was a lot of lack of transparency from President Biden. Either way, though, because of the fact that he was so cooperative and his team was so cooperative from the beginning, he's not being looked into right now for obstruction the way Trump is. So the cases are very different. The same with Mike Pence's case because of the level of cooperation. And so far, there doesn't appear to be any type of special counsel that is going to be appointed to look into Mike Pence's classified documents case. But honestly, I don't think anyone knows when these are going to wrap up, how long they're going to go on for. Of course, the politics of it all is not supposed to influence the special counsels. Ultimately, the final decision does rest with Merrick Garland once each of the special counsels make their recommendations on whether or not to charge President Biden or President Trump. And then Merrick Garland, the attorney general, has to make the ultimate decision. And every lawyer I've talked to or former DOJ prosecutor says there is going to be some politics that factors in. You can't look at all these cases in a vacuum.
Yep. We were hearing the same stuff as well, too. You could check out all of Laura's work over at pbs.org/newshour or catch her at PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings for time and station. And also she's a contributor across, I believe, CNN and maybe some other networks, but I always see her on CNN. You should be on other networks as well. She's a fantastic White House correspondent. Laura, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.